Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to Qatar Creates Talks. I'm Jelena Trkulja, editorial director of Qatar Creates Talks, and we begin today's program dedicated to architecture with a panel titled Building with Memory, Materials, Heritage, and Ecology, which explores how architects are reimagining buildings to respond to both place and planet. And to moderate this panel, we have with us Amir Berbic, designer, educator, and dean of Virginia Commonwealth University School of the Arts in Qatar, a role he has held since 2019. Amir's career spans leadership and teaching roles at the University of Illinois at Chicago and the American University of Sharjah. As a graphic designer, his work explores themes of place-based identity and displacement, spanning print, environmental graphics, and three-dimensional typography. And his work is held in the permanent collection of the Art Institute of Chicago. Please join me in welcoming Amir Berbic to guide today's conversation on architecture, memory, and the intersection of culture, materials, and ecology.
Thank you, Dr. Jelena, for the introduction and for allowing this humble graphic designer to moderate a panel with a group of architects. When I told a friend this morning that I was nervous, he told me, don't worry, just don't talk about architecture and you'll be fine. So that's the plan. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here. This panel brings architects whose work explores how design can engage with the past while responding to the urgencies of the present, environmental, cultural, and human. As our cities expand and the climate crisis intensifies, the question of how we build and what we choose to remember in that process has never been more relevant. Each of our panelists approaches this question from a distinct perspective, whether through material and craft, through heritage and conservation, or through research, innovation, and global practice. What unites them is a view of architecture as something that extends beyond making new things. It's about the relationship we sustain over time with materials, with place, and with the people who inhabit them. This conversation asks how architecture can remain rooted in human experience while adapting to a rapidly changing world. What it means, in other words, to build with memory. I am honored to introduce our panelists, and I should say that, of course, our panelists don't need much of an introduction, but it's the appropriate thing to do anyways. Rem Koolhaas is the founder of the Office for Metropolitan Architecture, OMA, and its research arm, AMO, and is one of the most influential architects and thinkers of our time. His projects, from the CCTV headquarters in Beijing to the Seattle Central Library and many, many others, have redefined how architecture engages with culture and urban life. Here in Qatar, his firm designed the Qatar National Library and the Qatar Foundation headquarters, both now landmarks of Qatar Foundation Education City. AMO created and designed the 2019 exhibition, Making Doha, which coincidentally was the first show that I got to see upon moving to Qatar that year. Mr. Koolhaas is the author of Delirious New York and Small, Medium, Large, Extra Large, and he curated the Venice Architecture Biennale and the Guggenheim's exhibition entitled Countryside, the Future. As many of you know, a new iteration of the Countryside exhibition opened in Doha earlier this week. Noura Al-Sayeh Holtrop is an architect and curator based in Bahrain, where she serves as advisor for heritage projects at the Bahrain Authority for Culture and Antiquities. She led the rehabilitation of the Pearling Path in Muharraq, a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and co-curated Bahrain's pavilion at the 2010 Venice Biennale, for which she received the Gold Lion Award. Her work explores how architecture and heritage can coexist within fragile cultural and ecological contexts. Ben van Berkel is the founder and principal architect of UN Studio, a global practice known for merging advanced technology with human-centered design. His major works include the Mobius House in the Netherlands, the iconic Erasmus Bridge in Rotterdam, and the Mercedes-Benz Museum in Stuttgart. In Qatar, his firm designed the Doha Metro Network and the Dadu Children's Museum. His projects and writings continue to shape conversations about innovation, experience, and the future of urban life. And I also learned that he started out as a graphic designer, which was a really interesting, really good find. Ibrahim Jada is Group CEO and Chief Architect of the Arab Engineering Bureau. His work bridges Qatari heritage and contemporary design with projects across the region and beyond. Among his many achievements is the Al Tumama Stadium, showcased during the 2022 FIFA World Cup in Qatar. He is a co-founder of the Qatar Green Building Council and author of The History of Qatari Architecture from 1800 to 1950, 99 Domes, Qatari Style, and Discovering Arabian Deco. In 2025, Ibrahim Jada received a Doctorate of Humane Letters from the Virginia Commonwealth University. Thank you, dear panelists, for being here and for this opportunity for dialogue. Maybe we can start by unpacking the theme of this panel. Each of you engages in different ways with the idea of architecture as a vessel of memory, whether through the materials you choose, the histories you reveal, or the ways you reinterpret place. The title of our conversation, Building with Memory, invites us to consider what that means in practice. Memory in architecture can be cultural or material, but also experiential, embedded in how a space makes us feel and what it allows us to remember. So to begin, I'd like to ask each of you to take a little bit of time to talk about how you interpret the idea of memory in architecture, what it means in your work, and how it continues to evolve in the world that we're building now.
Yeah, I can start, of course. Basically, your question kind of implies that as an architect, you are concerned with different issues as separate issues, i.e. that as an architect, you would kind of think of memory as a kind of as a substance that you could introduce in your architecture and which your architecture has to reflect. And I really want to resist that notion, because I think I would even be suspicious of any architect who would be deliberately concerned with memory in the beginning of any architectural project or even in the realization of an architectural project. Memory is something that happens, and I think it happens for very many different reasons. And I think it's not necessarily something that an architect can manipulate or not, unless, of course, you're interested in working on monuments or on deliberate devices for memory. And we had a kind of very interesting experience recently here in Doha, where we installed an exhibition on the countryside in an old school, and I deliberately describe it in a kind of insipid way, an old school that began in the 60s and was closed in 2008. And at first we really liked the building. It's a U-shaped building with classrooms and a gallery along the classrooms, but it's a very generic building. And if you look around in Doha, you see many of the same typology of architecture. And so it's absolutely certain that the architect wasn't concerned with memory, but simply doing a nice school. But the memories that kind of single thing triggered when we repurposed it for an exhibition are really kind of overwhelming. There was almost a stampede of alumni that kind of ran over us and kind of simply, I don't want to use disrespectful words, but and I won't, but on an incredible kind of return to their own past. And so neither us nor they, the original architect, was would anticipate that kind of possibility. So I would say that the fundamental secret of memory is to generate buildings and that are necessary and that are pleasant and that then create kind of interesting memories of their use and of their function. So this is a kind of a functionalist answer, but for the time being, that's all I can say.
Thank you so much. Noura?
Yeah, I would maybe, agree and elaborate maybe on that and the experience that we had on the Pearling Path, which was obviously a project when we started, which was charged with a lot of memory and a lot of history. But memory can also be very easily instrumentalized, and memory, can serve different agendas and can be also a projection of national agendas that are then projected back into the past in a very selective way, and this has an effect on both the intangible and tangible parts of a city that are then deemed important. And so it was really important for us when we started working on the project to kind of flatten out this idea of history and memory and relook at the city and the past and the Pearling past in a very non-hierarchical way, and giving importance to all aspects of different people's memories, some of which were very painful, others that were very nostalgic. And I think this was, 15 years ago in the Gulf, the situation was very different than it was today. And to me, as a young architect, it was really surprising because there were either very nostalgic depictions of the past or very kind of bold bets on the future through renders of a kind of projected future that had no relation to the current state of things. And the contemporary context as such somehow did not exist. It was not even somehow surveyed, it was not documented. Conversations would always kind of oscillate between a very rosy past and a bold future. And the current state somehow had no existence, in the city. And when we, and this had a lot to do with memory, of course, and the way that we wanted to use memory in relation to architecture, the shaping of a national identity through architecture, the shaping of possible futures through architecture. And so it was really important at the start of the project to just really survey and look at the past, look at the current state of the city without any projection of memory, without any projection of emotion or maybe nationalist ideas, and really looking at it through what it is and listening to the multitudes of memories that were present in the city, and through that stitching a kind of conversation between what was there in the city today and what a possible contemporary architecture could look like, taking into account all these different memories.
Thank you.
Yes, I similarly have I totally agree on the word memory and the linguistic interpretation of it, but I'm also interested in the way how you could rethink history, architectural history, or maybe the experience of certain aspects we remember from experiencing, or the visual experience, maybe I should say, and the experiential quality of that past. So often in our work, we lately noticed that it's not so important only to compose the most interesting organizational quality for a location or something what you would like to improve in the city, but make it so that it uplifts also a certain kind of experience and experiences you can pick up, of course, from the past. And for instance, my first major personal experience of a building I really thought was quite flabbergasting when I saw that for the first time was the Katsura Palace in Japan. And maybe there I discovered that it is not all about the visual language of architecture alone. And that's what I would like to emphasize. It's the sensorial, the space what can give you more layered qualities of meaning of that history. And I'm very fascinated in that. And maybe that's why I'm often referring also to art, because often I find, in artists one likes, you can read more layers of meaning. For instance, often example, quite interesting example is, for instance, the work of Francis Bacon. He picks up something of the past, the making of a portrait, but the portrait is totally morphed, and he uses a very interesting technique to translate something in a new way related to the making of the portrait. So that translation, giving a different set of layers of meaning, I find fascinating in the way how we look at the past.
Great, thank you. And I think we'll have hopefully we get to hear more about the sensory experience part of what you said in some of the other questions.
To me, I think we are a sort of a result in all the decisions we make of memories. I'd like to see memories exploring the future with it rather than living in the past of the memory. I think the places not only that we grew up in, but we visited as a young teenager, the impact that the Notre Dame did to me in terms of scale was amazing. Or living in a courtyard. Now, having all these memories helps us, in my opinion, make the right decision, because if you haven't seen it, if you haven't felt it, if you haven't smelled it, you wouldn't be able to create the new spaces of the modern without having such memories. And that's why I always recommend to the young architects, go explore, see the world, because all of these will embed into your thinking and your memories into recreating something for the future.
Thank you so much. Perhaps we could move from the idea of memory, and this is sort of going into my second question, from the idea of memory itself to the things that hold it, the materials that quite literally carry the stories of place. We often talk about materials in terms of performance or sustainability, but materials also carry histories. They embed knowledge, geography, and labor. They tell stories as much as they serve structure. It would be good to hear how you think about material as part of a larger narrative in your work, how choices of material can express or challenge ideas of culture, identity, or memory. And maybe we can start with you, Ibrahim. Since your practice directly works with heritage and craft, and then we can hear from the others as well.
I mean, in an ideal situation, when it comes to sustainability, is we use locally available materials. Now, with the amount of what we construct, if we use coral reefs or stone, or we don't have much mud, so it's quite challenging to sustain our environment. So I think the use of recycled or innovative materials that behaves and like the original materials in terms of sustainability, thermal conductivity, is where the creativity can become. And this use of material, it should have a sense of belonging in terms of its textures, its feeling, and its behavior to sustainability. And that's always a challenge now for us in terms of exporting all these materials and trying to maintain the sustainable qualities of the buildings. Fortunately, within the region, there are manufacturing of recycling or using the materials that belong to the area, but it's difficult not to use, and it will not be wise not to use the availability of technology and materials available around the world to recreate the qualities of the living qualities that we want to sort of continue of what our ancestors have continued in a more modern context.
Anyone else would you like to chime in here?
You know, I think part of the problem or the challenge of the current discourse around materials is that we've started somehow morally charging materials or emotionally charging materials, you know, in the way that some materials are considered good today, you know, wood, coral, stone, some materials are considered bad. But, you know, if we go back into the way that they were building in this part of the world in the 1930s, these choices were pragmatic choices related to, you know, economy, what was available, what was being traded. And so I think it's important to kind of uncharge this discussion about materials. And a lot of times, I think for me, the question of sustainability should be posed at an earlier stage of a project. So on the Pearling Path, for example, it's a quite large urban regeneration project over an area of, 5 to 7 square kilometers. It includes the rehabilitation of 18 structures, the constructions of a number of new buildings. But you know, we really posed ourselves the question at the start of the project of what was really necessary to build. And at the end, you know, of the project, although its impact on the city was quite large, we have approximately only under 1,000 square meters of new built climatized spaces in the city. And you know, these questions at the start of a project make a tremendous difference in terms of sustainability, you know, much more than if you would just pose the question of what specific material you're using. And a lot of that has become today in architecture very performative in a way, you know, because the economy of the way in which we are bringing in resources, we are extracting, are very different than from what the discourse is.
I'm really happy with those comments because I think the self-imposed moralism is really almost paralyzing the profession. And before we know it, the word memory kind of takes us to an almost obligation to respect and at the expense of any other kind of emotion you could feel or any intellectual attitude. And I think that rather than about memories, we should maybe kind of talk about preservation and interrogate the current values of preservation. Because preservation is still completely focused on exceptional elements, on monuments, on palaces, but not on the kind of generic environment that explains how we live. And I think that the only legitimate reason to preserve something is to teach your children or the future generations how things were. And that implies a totally different program, which is not necessarily based on kind of beauty, on kind of respect, but also on sometimes brutally kind of reusing things that are there, and as you say, simply not beginning every time with a new thing, but brutally adapting things that exist. So I want to get a little bit out of this kind of respectful tone, because I think that would be good for both architects, creators, but also for the public.
I agree with that totally, because before you know, we become sustainable architects, and the profession is on that level, expanding and expanding on many levels. Circularity is a whole new topic what needs to come in, without discussing the effects of sustainability. So I totally agree with this, but in the same time. There is this enormous amount of discussion about how we can make our planet healthier, etc. And I know the moral implications of this whole attitude. And that for that reason, I often think, maybe we should look more to our indoor, instead of looking at external environmental effects, maybe we should look more to indoor effects. You know, how the indoor spaces having a particular kind of quality, and what kind of environmental quality do they have on us? You know, think of air quality, acoustics, think of non-toxic or toxic materials. You know, what is it? What does that do to us all? And that is even worse than our outdoor environment. So let's turn the discussion the other way around, of what we can do towards the way how we reinterpret sustainability.
Thank you, and I think this next question is going to try to look at this from a slightly broader context. Although I think you've touched on this a little bit already. You know, sustainability, of course, is discussed a lot, as you just have, and it's in some ways viewed as an architectural imperative. But of course, we also know that ecological responsibility, for example, isn't only about performance. It's also about culture. It's also about context and care for place. And I don't say this from a kind of a moralizing position, but just out of an interest in a fruitful conversation. Architects today operate globally, as many of you do, in environments with very different social and ecological conditions. So the question is, how can design remain environmentally and culturally grounded while engaging an increasingly global conversation? And maybe Ben and Rem, I can start with you, given that both of your firms work internationally across very different climates and cultures. How do you approach ecological responsibility in ways that are sensitive to local conditions, and at the same time ensuring that global practice remains responsive to context?
Well, I think this is a very political question, and I'm happy that you pose it. And I can explain it on a personal level, even though I do not consider my own trajectory as exemplary. And for instance, somewhere maybe 20 years ago, I decided that ecological issues would never be relevant in America. And then I decided to work in China because I had a kind of instinct or information that China was one of the few countries in the world that took environment seriously, and that it was practically working on the kind of switch from a fossil economy to an other economy. And you have no idea how controversial that decision was, but for me it was a very solid decision, kind of simply because I aligned myself with a domain that was actually working in that direction. And kind of rather than proclaim my good intentions or anything, I simply did it. So in my case, this is the answer.
Yeah, I have these similar experiences, that it is so interesting to be working in a global level, because you learn from different places where you work enormously. Like, for instance, I discovered that social sustainability, for instance, if that is a good term, is something where I'm also fascinated in how people commute, how people gather and create communities, for instance. And in South Korea, I discovered for the first time that when I promoted with a particular client there, that it would be good to create more community spaces around a particular set of high-rises in the area where we were working on. that would be good to introduce also a certain form of technology that people could communicate better with each other. But then over the years, I discovered that the South Koreans are the best in living in high rises because they set up their own community. They make sure that they sport together, that they have their own kind of social system to make sure that they talk with each other in an elevator, whereas we have the tendency maybe not to talk to each other in an elevator, etc., etc. So I can give, in that sense, many examples of how you can cross over this cross-combinatorial knowledge to hybridize that in further ways of how you can convince maybe other cultures to think of working with neighborhoods in the sky, for instance.
Thank you. Thank you both. Maybe to bring it closer to home, and maybe Ibrahim and Noura can talk about this. Your work is deeply rooted in this region, where the environment has always shaped settlement, material, and craft. And so the question is, how do you integrate ecological thinking into design in ways that honor local realities? I think, Ibrahim, you touched on that a little bit earlier when we talked about materials, but or memory, but climate, resources, and culture, while contributing to the broader global conversation.
I mean, culture and heritage is becoming like an important issue, and sometimes limits to some people may limit the creativity. In my opinion, we could use heritage as like the DNA of our culture, as only as a DNA, because our culture, I think, is our social values, our scale, our reaction to our environment. That, I think, that's what we can take from our culture to utilize to become more sustainable. Because, like I always would say to even the younger generation, let's learn from the past, from what we have inherited, how responsible were our ancestors to the environment in terms of sustainability, the orientation of a building. So I think that if we use that DNA just for our social values, the scale, our response to our environment, and we could be as contemporary, as creative as we want to be, and as sensitive as we want to be, whether from internally to externally, that then we can have something that really belongs to wherever you're designing.
And maybe also resist thinking of culture as only something that is of the past, but really think about cultural production today. Noura?
Definitely. I think, the ancestral practices and customs were, sustainability as a word didn't exist back in those days, but it was just about common sense and being a bit pragmatic in the way that you think about these things. And so we try to approach, projects in that way. And I think a lot of times it has more to do maybe with decisions that have to do with operational matters related to buildings. We've been thinking a lot about seasonality in this part of the world and migratory customs. People would live in different places in the country in winter and in summer. And for example, on the Purling Path, we took the decision that in the summer we would just close it because, 47 plus degrees, no one is comfortable walking in the heat, and that, for sustainability purposes, it makes a lot more sense to just work with our environment and accept that, there are some parts of the year where it is simply too hot to practice these spaces in the way that it was done previously, and to work with these seasons instead of against them, So in the same way that a ski station closes, once the snow is gone. And I think we've been so used with the advent of technology of constantly trying to conquer our environment. And sometimes going back to more very basic principles, that don't have to do with LEED certifications but have to do with common sense. bring back sustainable practices that are actually very culturally rooted in this part of the world.
Yeah, thank you so much. So I'll move to sort of the next subtopic. We talked about context. We talked about responsibility. Perhaps we can shift to process, how we design, how we build, and how technology is reshaping both. Digital tools have opened new possibilities for precision and experimentation, but there's an enduring need for material connection, for architecture that feels made and not just produced, perhaps. So, Ben, I can start with you. And when we did a little rehearsal earlier, you said, why do I always get the technology question? But we'll stick with that, and then we'll see if our other panelists have more to contribute. But your work often integrates advanced computation with sensory experience. For instance, in Dadu, the Children's Museum, and you mentioned that earlier, which UN Studio designed. How do you see technology and craft informing one another in your process?
Yeah, I like technology. Maybe that's why I said this to you. But the reason why I like it is simply because it is a tool. It is a tool that can expand the enormous amount of possible effects you can get out of the tool. So I don't see that technology can do more than that it is only a fantastic tool. But you have to be careful with it as well, because if you over moralize or aestheticize the tool, then then you get data or visual technological effects, but who can become kitsch. So you have to be very careful how you introduce these tools. But for instance, very nice example is the Arnhem train station we worked on several years ago, where we wanted to make a totally transparent station so that people could see where they would have to move to, that daylight would coming into the station. So it became almost totally column-free. But the faults of the station were quite difficult to make. And we wanted to make it in concrete, but then we worked with several contractors and discussed it with several contractors how we could do it. And with the technology we used, there was a contractor who said, this is what we cannot do in concrete. So he offered to talk to a shipbuilder, and the shipbuilder had the technology. He could build a project in segments, in modular elements, and it was built even more slender and more elegant than we had imagined in concrete. And that brings me to the combination of how you can influence and stimulate and motivate through technology the craft of the profession and the making of things. And that fascinates me a lot. So where maybe if the profession expanding on all these topics of sustainability and other things we have to incorporate lately, if we have to, then technology helps there too to expand further. But we have to be careful that we then don't lose our interest in the sensorial and the making of things. So the craft of making things.
Any other thoughts on this question from the others? Okay. We'll move on, and I'm also conscious of time. I'm looking at Dr. Jelena, who'll signal to me when time is up. But perhaps we can zoom out even more and think about the city itself as a sort of living record of how societies evolve. Cities hold our collective memory. They change, erase, and reinvent what came before. And architecture becomes both a witness and a catalyst in that process. Rem, your countryside exhibition, which is now here in Doha, looks at how much of our planet's transformation is happening outside of cities. Yet many of your projects have also redefined the urban condition itself. And I can start with you and then turn it over to the others. How do you navigate the relationship between preservation and reinvention? And I don't intentionally present those as dichotomies, but just just to frame the question between recording change and at the same time provoking it.
It's a very nice question, and obviously a very simple reason why we started to look at the countryside is that we began to feel that cities are only becoming more urban, only becoming more busy, only becoming more technological, but not fundamentally changing, and that the global rush to the city actually created an entirely new situation in the countryside, because countryside in the near future has to live with maybe 1/3 or even 1/4 the amount of its original inhabitants. And that means that it's a kind of entirely new kind of situation, which in itself has its own fascination, but also its own potential for recording memory and for creating its own memory. And I recommend, if you go to the show, the section on Central Asia, which was formerly a colony of the Soviet Union, and which a country like Kazakhstan, for instance, has had to deal with nuclear tests, with incredible space age operations, with fantastic solar farms on a scale that nobody has ever seen kind of before in the 80s. And all of that is kind of basically embedded in, not in cities, of course, but in the countryside itself. For me, it's kind of very moving and let's say beyond every formal definition of memory, very moving to see how an entire population is dealing on the one hand with that amazing inheritance, on the other hand with the disappearing kind of people, and at the same time somehow the obligation to maintain ground in mostly traditional ways, but with, of course, a total cover of digital entities like mobile phones, etc. So what I would hope, and what I was hoping through creating that kind of show, is to break the connection between memory and nostalgia, or between memory and conservatism, and to kind of simply indicate the kind of fantastic new associations that are happening all over the world, and particularly if you don't look at cities.
Noura, yeah, go ahead, please.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because the situation in cities in this part of the world differs very much from the Western world, let's say. There's still very much active sites of transformation. And when we started working on the project, our biggest battles was not with what we would maybe demolish or build new. It was specifically about the extent of what we wanted to preserve. So it's a kind of complete opposite situation. And what we were seeking to preserve, not in the monumental, which, you know, for reasons we discussed earlier, was a lot easier to battle for, but for the grain of the urban fabric and the generic that was deemed to not have so much value. But there was also something really interesting in that there is in this part of the world really still a strong belief in, let's say, modernity in its loose understanding, and in novelty. It's something that is still very much appreciated. And we then use that to our advantage in the project, and that in the contemporary architecture that we introduced, we were able to introduce you know, a kind of architecture that was very bold and experimental, which in another context, you know, where preservation was kind of frozen, we would not be able to have built. And I think, you know, when you try to look at these challenges as an advantage that can produce something new that would not have been able to exist in another context, the end result then also produces something that is specific to your local context, taking things that maybe could have become, a challenge to produce something new.
Yeah, yeah. I think that you of course have in the further growth and the intensification of these cities where we are dealing with, especially in this part of the world, we have constantly this question of how do we deal with the way how we can see or develop other ways how to relax these cities a little bit more, because as you know, in Dubai it takes almost 2 hours now lately to move from one side of the city to the other side of the city. It's having another kind of life than it had maybe when the vision for that city was having another ambition, then it could predict its own results of that vision. So when we, for instance, worked here on the metro stations and the metro lines, one of the first things Her Excellency said, what is the most important for us is that we can bring people again towards each other, that they can see each other, and that they can step out of the car. And of course that metro line system was necessary for many other reasons, not only for the World Cup alone, but it is actually made for people here to communicate with each other, socialize with each other, to see each other. And for that reason, these are not stations anymore. We didn't design them as stations, but as important social crossing points where people could meet and interact with each other. And luckily enough, this city is actually opening up more than ever than any other cities in this region when it comes down to the life and the openness of the city. I've never seen over the last 4 or 5 years so many people on terraces, for instance, and being on the street than let's say 10 years ago. So the interaction of, if it is the landscape or the city, it's again what it does have for effect on people. I find it quite fascinating.
Yeah, Ibrahim, please go ahead.
I will zoom back to Doha. I've researched extensively the transformation our city went through, and I put this in publication, whether it's the pre-oil period. The most important is the beginning of the oil period, in my opinion, as that showed how a society can transform from simple courtyard living into what's so-called modern and such a fast transition. We're lucky we didn't get out of track so much. At least we still dressed up with the same clothes, have the same accent, eat the same food, still have the same habits of welcoming people and so on. But there was a lot of destruction, the beginning of the oil, and we don't blame the previous generation, destruction of the old neighborhoods. Our early modern was not recognized as part of our history until very recently, 15 years or so, thanks to Sheikh Al-Mayasa and the museums to preserve this. The school that you referred to, I went to school there, and you have goosebumps to know that this place that you learned, and in the last book that I did, the Discovering Arabian Deco, we documented the early schools, the early government buildings, and that transformation was so interesting, and how we are adaptive and accepting into moving into something else. I think the biggest challenge or social effect was our ancestors, when they moved in from the courtyard houses, again, you don't blame anybody, but they saw some villas in Beirut or in Bombay or in Cairo, and they moved from these courtyard houses into boxes called villas with verandas that they never sat in because privacy is not there. And that part of the transition, I think, had made a little bit of impact that's worth studying into how we can evolve into a better living condition that sustain the habits and the culture in a way. Otherwise, our cities are moving quite well, in my opinion.
Thank you all very much. This has been a generous and deeply insightful conversation, and I'm really honored to be sharing this stage with all of you. I suppose if there's one thread that's running through everything we've heard, is that building with memory isn't only about looking backward, or isn't about looking backward, but about creating continuity between past and future, between craft and technology, between global practice and local life. And architecture in this case becomes a form of care for place and for the people who inhabit it over time. So thank you very much.